Let's conclude our first major topic by bringing together the roles of nature, society, and culture in the development of personality. These three concepts appear throughout the psychology of personality. No matter which theoretical approach you study, you will encounter them again and again. For that reason, it is worth identifying the key ideas associated with each one before we move on. Let's begin with nature. In the literature, you will often come across the expression, the natural or organic prerequisites of personality development. That wording is important because it immediately tells us what nature is and what it is not. Nature does not create personality by itself. Nature provides only the prerequisites. It gives us the starting point. It gives us the raw material from which personality may eventually develop. Our inherited abilities, our temperament, our biological characteristics. These all belong to this category. They are real, they matter, and they influence development. But none of them should be confused with personality itself. The same applies to many of the personal problems people experience throughout life. Very often, we assume that those problems originate entirely within us. In reality, our natural characteristics merely create certain possibilities. They establish the conditions under which particular difficulties may later emerge. Even something as ordinary as our appearance illustrates this principle. Think about the color of your eyes, or the shape of your nose, or the form of your ears. By themselves, these features carry almost no psychological meaning. They begin to matter only when we compare ourselves with someone else. Only when another person becomes the point of comparison do those biological characteristics suddenly acquire personal significance. In other words, something that begins as a natural characteristic becomes psychologically meaningful only within a social relationship. That distinction is essential. So, we might describe natural prerequisites in another way. They are simply the initial conditions. Imagine solving a puzzle. Every puzzle begins with something that has already been given to you. You don't choose those pieces. You don't replace them with different ones. They simply arrive as part of the problem itself. Your task is not to change the starting conditions. Your task is to discover a new way of organizing them until the solution becomes possible. Human development follows much the same pattern. Our biological characteristics are the material we receive at the beginning of life. They provide the foundation, but they do not determine the final result. Personality develops through the continual transformation of those original conditions. Of course, that transformation is not unlimited. We cannot simply ignore the laws of nature. No matter how creative we are, biological reality still places certain boundaries on what is possible. A simple example comes from memory. You may organize information in many different ways. You may invent new strategies for remembering it. The meaningful units themselves may vary considerably. Yet the overall capacity of working memory remains limited. As George Miller famously proposed, it is approximately 7 ± 2 meaningful units. The units may change. The biological limitation does not. That is why we speak of natural prerequisites. Nature provides the beginning of development. It does not provide its conclusion. Now let us turn to the second concept, society. Here the central statement is both simple and extremely important. The social environment is a necessary condition for the development of personality. The phrase deserves careful attention. Notice that we say the social environment is necessary. We do not say that it is sufficient. Those are two very different claims. The first is unquestionably true. A human being becomes a personality only through life with other people. Without language, without communication, without shared activity, and without participation in society, personality simply cannot emerge. In that sense, society is absolutely indispensable. There is very little to argue about here. We have already discussed this idea from several different perspectives. Everything points to the same conclusion. Personality first appears only within a social world. However, psychology requires us to make one more distinction. The social environment is necessary for what we might call the first birth of personality. It is through society that a child enters the human world. It is through relationships with other people that language is acquired, values begin to form, and the first sense of self gradually develops. Without that social foundation, personality cannot take shape. But this raises another question. Is society alone enough to explain the complete development of personality? The answer is no. It is necessary for the first birth. It is not sufficient for the second. Psychologists often describe conditions in exactly this way. Some conditions are necessary. Without them, a process cannot even begin. But they are not sufficient, because something more is required before the process can be completed. The development of personality follows that same pattern. Society gives us the opportunity to become a personality. Eventually, however, another stage begins. There comes a point when a person can no longer rely entirely on external guidance. Parents cannot solve every problem. Teachers cannot make every important decision. Friends cannot provide every answer. The individual eventually encounters problems that must be faced alone. That is what we mean by the second birth of personality. At this stage, a person begins to organize life independently. The individual accepts responsibility for decisions, actions, and consequences. External support remains valuable, but it no longer determines every step. Personality begins to regulate itself. In that sense, the second birth occurs not because society disappears, but because the individual becomes capable of acting without depending completely upon it. This is why the social environment is necessary, yet not sufficient. It begins the process. It does not complete it. That brings us to the third concept, culture. Here we arrive at perhaps the most important question in this discussion. What exactly do we mean when we speak about a cultural norm? There are many possible answers, but I would summarize everything we have discussed so far in three closely related ideas. The first is this. A cultural norm is a universal principle for solving specific personal problems. That definition deserves to be examined carefully. Earlier, when we discussed problem solving, we agreed that every problem contains two different elements. First, there is the principle by which the problem is solved. Second, there is the application of that principle to a particular situation. Those two things should never be confused. Consider a familiar example from mathematics. You read a problem. After examining it, you realize that it is a problem involving the Pythagorean theorem. The theorem itself is not the complete solution. Rather, it tells you which principle should guide your thinking. The specific numbers may change from one problem to another. The details of the situation may be entirely different. Yet, the underlying principle remains exactly the same. Culture operates in much the same way. A cultural norm does not provide ready-made answers to every situation. Instead, it offers a general principle that can be applied across many different circumstances. Each person's life is unique. Each problem has its own details. But the cultural principle provides a stable framework for approaching those problems thoughtfully and consistently. That is why we call it universal. Not because every situation is identical, but because the same principle can guide us through many different situations. The second idea follows naturally from the first. A cultural object is a means of transforming nature. At first, this definition may sound rather abstract, but in fact, it describes something we encounter constantly in everyday life. Alexei Leontiev illustrated this idea with a remarkably simple example, one that captures the entire principle. He asks us to consider how a young child learns to eat with a spoon. At first glance, it seems like an ordinary skill. Psychologically, however, it reveals something much deeper. Think about the child's experience during the first stage. From the child's point of view, the spoon is not helpful at all. It is an unnecessary object. Eating with the hand is easier. It is faster. It feels completely natural. The spoon seems to interfere rather than assist. In other words, the spoon begins as nothing more than an external attachment to the body's natural abilities. If the child were left entirely alone, something predictable would happen. Even while holding the spoon, the child would still reach toward the food with the free hand. The natural movement would continue to dominate. Anyone who has watched a toddler eat has seen the result. The spoon is in the hand. The food is everywhere. And the porridge somehow ends up behind the child's ear instead of in the mouth. That is the first stage. Nature is still in control. Then comes the second stage. And according to Leontiev, this is the truly important one. It is also the more difficult stage. An adult, usually a parent, guides the child's hand. The movement is no longer completely spontaneous. Little by little, something begins to change. Leontiev expresses this change with a remarkably precise phrase. The movement gradually becomes subordinated to the logic of the tool. Think carefully about what that means. At first, the child controls the spoon according to the body's natural impulses. Eventually, the opposite becomes true. The spoon begins to organize the movement of the hand itself. The requirements of the tool determine how the hand must move. The hand adjusts. The body learns. A new form of action appears. Now ask yourself an interesting question. What has become of the hand? Physically, nothing has changed. It is still the same biological organ. The muscles are the same. The bones are the same. The anatomy has not been altered. But psychologically, something profound has happened. The hand has been transformed. Nature has been reorganized through culture. A hand that knows how to use a spoon is no longer simply a natural organ. The same is true of an eye capable of appreciating a painting, or an ear capable of hearing the structure and beauty of music. Biologically, they remain parts of the human body. Psychologically, however, they have become something more. They have become organs that have been developed through culture. Natural abilities have been reorganized by participation in human activity. That is precisely what culture accomplishes. It does not replace nature, it transforms nature. Culture takes what biology provides and reshapes it into something capable of participating in specifically human forms of life. This idea brings us to the third and final characteristic of culture. A cultural prohibition, or more broadly, a cultural norm, is a means of protecting transformed nature. Once nature has been transformed, it must also be protected. That is the role of cultural rules. Perhaps the simplest way to express the idea is this: if you transform nature, you also become responsible for preserving what you have transformed. To understand this idea, we do not need a complicated psychological example. An ordinary example from everyday life is enough. Think about the invention of the automobile. When automobiles first appeared, there were very few rules governing how people should use them. Pedestrians moved wherever they wished. Drivers behaved according to their own judgment. Everyone acted independently, and everyone believed they had the right of way. The result was exactly what we would expect: confusion, conflict, danger. The technology itself was not the problem. The problem was that society had created something new without yet creating the cultural norms necessary to protect it. Eventually, traffic laws emerged. Those rules did not exist to restrict freedom for its own sake. They existed to preserve a new form of human activity. They protected both drivers and pedestrians. They allowed people to share the same space without constant conflict. If everyone follows those rules, the road becomes a predictable and relatively safe environment. Of course, we all know that people do not always obey traffic laws. That is not the point. The existence of violations does not make the rules unnecessary. The rules continue to perform the same cultural function, whether individuals follow them or not. The same principle applies much more broadly. Cultural norms are not valuable simply because they tell us what to do. Their deeper purpose is to preserve the forms of life that culture itself has created. Every important cultural achievement eventually requires protection. Language requires rules. Education requires standards. Scientific work requires methods. Art requires traditions. Human relationships require shared expectations. Without those norms, culture gradually loses the very structures it has spent generations creating. That is why cultural norms are not merely restrictions. They are also forms of preservation. They protect what human activity has already transformed. Perhaps we can express this entire idea in very simple language. Once you transform nature, you also assume responsibility for it. Transformation and responsibility always belong together. One without the other is incomplete. Few people have expressed this idea more beautifully than the French writer and aviator Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. Most of us remember the famous line from The Little Prince: "You become responsible forever for what you have tamed." That sentence captures the psychological meaning of culture remarkably well. If you have transformed something, if you have shaped it, if you have made it part of the human world, then you also become responsible for protecting it. Responsibility is not something added afterward, it is part of the transformation itself. In that sense, every genuine cultural achievement carries with it an obligation. Culture is not simply about creating, it is also about preserving. And with that, we can conclude our discussion of the first major question. Having established the roles of nature, society, and culture in the development of personality, we are now ready to move on to the second question.